Good morning, student. Today we're going to read about the chapter What is Democracy and Why Democracy. Previously, in our last video, you have learned about the two tales of democracy of Chile and Poland and how the various countries are becoming democratic in the world. You have learned. Now, today we will read about what is democracy, what are its features, and why slowly and gradually the world government is transforming into a democratic government and is the most prevalent form of government in the world today. And slowly and gradually it is expanding to more and more countries. And why is it so? What makes better than other form of government the democratic government? So today we're going to learn these things in this chapter. What is democracy and why democracy? We have distinguished democratic government and non-democratic government, taking example from the situation in Poland and Chile. The Allendez rule in Chile, that is a democratic rule, whereas the Pinochet rule in Chile, which is non-democratic rule. So we have a general conception of what is democratic and what is non-democratic. Now, coming to why we need to define democracy. We know that democracy is a form of government which is government of the people, by the people and for the people, which is concerned with the people only. So there is some discussion and conversation between the children in the classroom situation. So how a democracy can be defined has been given. So I am skipping this one and going to the simple definition of democracy. So simply, when we called a government a democratic government, when it is the government which is chosen by the people. So democracy is a form of government in which the rulers are elected by the people. So the definition allows us to separate democracy from other forms of government that are clearly non-democratic. For example, the army rulers of Myanmar were not elected by the people, so it cannot be termed as democracy. Or take an example, people had no say in the decision in Myanmar, so it cannot be called as a democratic. Or a dictator like Pinochet in Chile are not elected by the people also. So the king of Saudi Arabia rule not because of the people have chosen them or do so, but because they happen to be born into the royal family. That means a monarchy. So all such example of Myanmar, Chile, Saudi Arabia, these are all non-democratic government. These are all non-democratic government. So the simple definition is not adequate. It reminds us that democracy is people's rule. But if we use the definition in an unthinking manner, we would end up calling almost every government that holds an election as a democratic. But it is not true. The government can hold election, but every government holding election cannot be called a democratic. So now take a look. Some government having election, though they cannot be termed as a democratic. So with the features of democracy, we can differentiate between what are democratic government and what are non-democratic government. So democracy is a form of government in which the rulers are elected by the people. That is a clear, simple definition. So this raises many questions. Who are the rulers in this definition? Which official must be elected for any government to be called a democracy? Which decision may be taken by non elected officials in a democracy? What kind of election constitutes what kind of election constitutes the democratic election? What condition must be fulfilled for an election to be considered democratic? Who are the people who can elect the rulers or get elected as rulers? So these are the various questions that come us in our mind. So while reading the features of democracy, these questions just hammer in our mind. So major decision by elected leaders. Suppose take the example of Pakistan, where General Parvez Musharraf led a military coup in October 1999. He overthrew a democratically elected government and declared himself the chief executive of the country. Later, he changed his resignation to president in 2002 and held a referendum in the country that granted him a 5-year extension. Pakistani media, human rights organizations, and democracy activists said that the referendum was based on rulers. They cannot take the final decision. The power to take final decision rested with army officials and with General Musharraf. And none of them were elected by the people. This happens in many dictatorship and monarchical form of government. So they formally have an elected parliament and government, but the real power is rested on whom? With the president. So here also the democratic essence have been hampered. Thus in a democracy, the final decision making power must rest those with the people who are solely responsible for electing the representative. Now, the second features of democracy is holding a free and fair election. So regarding the free and fair election, that means the universal adult franchise. Whether all the country have this universal adult franchise, that we're going to read. Suppose taking example of China. Elections are regularly held in China after every 5 years for electing the country's parliament. The National People's Congress has the power to appoint the president of the country. It has nearly 3,000 members elected from all over China. Some members are elected by the army also. Before contesting election, a candidate needs the approval of the Chinese Communist Party. So only those who are members of the Chinese Communist Party or 8 smaller parties allied to it were allowed to contest election. See, only those who are under the banner of Chinese Communist Party, they can contest election. So is this a democracy? No, certainly not. The government is always formed by the Communist Party in China that deny democracy. Since its independence in 1930, Mexico hold elections after every 6 years to elect its president. Another example, the country has never been under a military or dictator rule, but until 2000, every election was owned by a party called PRI in Mexico. Opposition parties did contest election but never managed to win. The PRI was known to use many dirty tricks to win election. So all those who were employed in government offices had to attend its party meeting. Teachers of government schools used to force parents to vote for the PRI. Media largely ignored the activities of opposition political party except to criticize them. Sometimes the polling booths were shifted from one place to another in the last minute, which made it difficult for people to cast their vote. So the PRI spent a large sum of money in the campaigning for its candidate. So should we consider the election described above as an example of people electing their rulers? Certainly not. So, reading all those examples, we get a sense that we cannot. There are many problems here. In China, the election do not offer the people any serious choice because there is only one party, that is Communist Party of China. They have to choose the ruling party and the candidate approved by it only. So, can we call this a choice? No. In a Mexican example, also people seems to really have a choice, but in practice they had no choice. There was no way the ruling party could be defeated, even if people were against it. There are not fair election. So the features of democracy having free and fair election is denied in all the cases that I have said you. So we can thus add a second feature to understand of democracy, that means holding election of any kind is not sufficient. The election must offer a real choice between political alternatives, and it should be possible for people to use this choice to remove the existing rulers if they wish so. So, a democracy must be based on free and fair election, where those currently in power have a fair chance of losing. So, this is the second feature of democracy, and thus, while maintaining this feature, such a government can be truly said as democracy. The third feature of democracy is one person, one vote, and one value. Earlier, we read about how the struggle for democracy was linked to the demand for universal adult franchise in various cases. So, this principle has now come to be accepted almost all over the world. That means universal adult franchise has been taken as granted in many of the countries. Until 2015, in case of Saudi Arabia, women did not have the right to vote. So the women are denied for voting rights in Saudi Arabia. Example of Estonia has made its citizenship rules in such a way that people belonging to Russian minority find it difficult to get the right to vote. In case of Fiji, the electoral system is such that the vote of an indigenous Fiji has more value than that of the Indian Fijian. See, there is a there is a differences, and the constitution does not provide the equal right or equal political right of voting for every individual. So democracy is based on a fundamental principle of political equality that gives us the third feature of democracy. In a democracy, every adult citizen must have one vote, one, and each vote must have one value. The fourth feature of democracy is the rule of law and respect for rights. Taking the example from Zimbabwe, which has attained independence from white minority rule in 1980. Since then, the country has been ruled by ZANU-PF, the party that led the freedom struggle. Its leader, Robert Mugabe, ruled the country since independence. Elections were held regularly and always owned by ZANU-PF. President Mugabe was a popular but was also used unfair practice in elections. So over the years, his government changed the constitution several times to increase the powers of the president and make him less accountable. Opposition party workers were harassed and their meeting disrupted. Public protests and demonstration against the government were declared illegal. So there was a law that limited the right to criticize the president. Television and radio were controlled by the government and gave only the ruling party's version. There were independent newspapers, but the government harassed those journalists and ignored some court judgments that were against it and pressurized judges. He was forced out of office in 2017. So the example of Zimbabwe shows that the popular approval of the ruler is necessary in a democracy, but it is not sufficient. Popular government can be undemocratic also. Popular leaders can be autocratic also. If we wish to assess a democracy, it is important to look at the election. But it is equally important to look before and after the elections. That means there should be sufficient room for normal political activity, including political opposition, in the period before election. They request that the state should respect some basic rights of the citizens. They should be free to think, to have opinions, to express their views and publicly, to form association, to protest and take other political actions. So everyone should be equal in the eye of law. This rights must be protected by an independent judiciary body, which orders are obeyed by everyone. So similarly, there are some conditions that apply to the way a government is run after the election. A democratic government cannot be whatever it likes, simply because it has won an election. It has to respect some basic rules. In particular, it has to respect some guarantees to the minorities. Every major decision has to go through a series of consultation. Every office bearer has certain rights and responsibility assigned by the constitution and the law. So each of this is accountable not only to the people but also to other independent officials. So both this aspect give us the fourth and final feature of democracy, that is a democratic government rules within limits that are set by the constitution, not law or constitution, and it should respect the citizens' right. So the four features that we have studied about democracy truly tells that what democracy means. So without these four features, certainly a country which is so called as democracy cannot be truly called democracy. So we have read about the democracy, what is democracy, what are the various features of democracy, citing some example from Myanmar, from Pakistan, from Chile, from Zimbabwe. So these are the common features of democracy which are labeled for democratic setup of government. But sometimes certain government which claim as democratic cannot be truly called as democracy because those countries do not have those features of democratic rule. So we can sum up that though some country claim that they are democratic, but those four features of democracy have to be fulfilled in every respect, then only a country can be termed as a democracy. Thanking you, student. Next day we'll continue with this chapter.